Okay, so we're gonna talk about Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter. From what I was reading about this seminar, it's extremely important because he builds upon the symbolic order a lot here compared to, I guess, in his previous works. So this is pretty important because of where he places it in his book Acree as well. Um, so it's gonna be very kind of integral to understanding the symbolic order and how subjectivity takes place for Lacan, which is going to be different than Freud, and this is also why Deleuze and Guattari build on Lacan here for the disjunctive synthesis. So a little bit of background, the reason why I chose this kind of reading to do was because in chapter 1.5 of Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari talk about how this seminar in particular serves to show a kind of code to desiring machines, or a code to the recording process or the production of recording. So this seminar is pretty important. This seminar is also known, though, as being extremely difficult and dense. That's kind of what people take from this seminar. So the idea here, or the hope, is that we all can kind of talk about what this means. Obviously, I'm not an arbiter on Lacan at all. So we're gonna need some help here as a kind of group. So the way that I've done readings, and I like to do readings, is more of like a sentence by sentence or paragraph kind of style, where we kind of talk about um, each kind of sentence or kind of questions as we go. And I think that kind of allows for the most in-depth form of reading. Um, at any moment, if we're going too slow or something, just like feel free to say something. So with that being said, oh, do I have background noise right now? August?
Yeah, whenever you talk and the noise gets,
Is that
uh,
for anyone else?
the term for it is.
Okay, is that for anyone else here?
Yes, but it's not too bad.
Shoot. Okay, I don't know. Let me see. Hmm. I wonder if I should change my speaker
Classic,
here.
classic
Classic.
quarantine collective reading.
I wonder if I should. My heater's on. Should I just turn that off? Here, give me 1 second.
We get this.
Okay, I just turned it off. Sorry, August. It might take a second, but is it like good enough to just continue?
Yeah, it's not terrible.
Okay, cool. So the first kind of sentence here is in German. I think it doesn't make sense to fully go into it now because it's going to kind of be indicative of the entire piece that we're about to read. Um, I do not speak German, so I'm not going to attempt to read it in German. But from what I kind of read and just throwing it into Google Translate, um, and if it pleases us and if it's appropriate, then it is thoughts. So we're going to kind of talk about what that means towards the end. I think it
Uh,
makes sense.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I have the physical copy, and it has in the footnotes. It has a Kaufman's translation, which is, and if we score hits and everything fits, it's thoughts that we feel,
If we score hits and what?
and everything fits, it's
Okay.
thoughts that we feel.
Awesome. That's cool.
That's
I
that's the
like that
Walter
better,
Kaufman.
I like that better. So I thank you for bringing that up. I don't have like a physical copy here. I just kind of took this from the website for where the seminars are, and I noticed there are a few kind of like a few errors here too with some typos. So thanks. And if there's anything, just feel free to share. So you were, I guess we'll see how that kind of takes place when we get to maybe the letter as a pure signifier. I was thinking about that. But uh, but let's start here. Our inquiry has led us to the point of recognizing that the repetition automatism finds its basis in what we have called the insistence of the signifying chain. We have elaborated the notion itself as a correlate of the existence or eccentric place in which we must necessarily locate the subject of the unconscious if we are to take Freud's discovery seriously. As is known, it is in the realm of experience inaugurated by psychoanalysis that we may grasp along what imaginary lines the human organism, in the most intimate recesses of its being, manifests its capture in a symbolic dimension. So Lacan is starting out strong here. The big thing that his focus is going to be on and his kind of ambitious goal throughout this piece is what repetition automatism is here, this kind of concept. Does anyone kind of know what this is or have thoughts on that? Any kind of definition, maybe? The best that I can kind of come up with is maybe that it's this it's coming from Sigmund Freud's beyond the pleasure principle, and it's this idea of a repetition of certain behaviors, even if those behaviors can be uh, can be harmful. So some like examples we could look at is if there's an individual potentially repeatedly checking to see if their door is locked, or someone who is consistently choosing emotionally distant partners as a result of childhood abandonment, or someone ruminating on negative thoughts repeatedly. So it's this repeated automatism that's going on, but it's important to note that this is something that is unconscious. So it's not like individuals are purposefully, saying like I'm going to do X, but rather it's something that just happens. So as we can kind of also see with maybe Deleuze and Guattari, just because that's the background that I have coming into this, why do kind of these repetitive things happen? For Lacan, I'm sure he's not going to be asking, like, how does the heart know how it beat, how to beat repeatedly? But instead, he's going to start with this kind of global person. Why is this individual or this subject consistently doing these repetitive behaviors? And what he's going to say here is that it is because of the insistence of the signifying chain right here, the insistence of the signifying chain. So a lot of this, as we kind of said earlier, is going to come down to the symbolic order, this order that is, part and parcel with language and social conventions and rules and social norms. All of this is extremely important for repetition automatism. And the way that he's defining this symbolic order is a signifying chain. And this signifying chain is going to be how these signs are intrinsically linked to one another. So we might want to think about how might we know what a certain animal like a dog is? Well, we know that a dog is not a cat, a dog is not a frog, a dog is not an elephant, so on and so forth. So the way that we can understand sort of language and symbols symbolically would be through a chain. Everything is kind of interconnected in this chain as well. So we're going to see kind of how repetition automatism happens with this chain. Is anyone familiar, or does anyone have an idea about why Lacan says existence here like this? X dash existence. Like, is there any idea why he might be saying this?
The translator added an endnote for this one. If you want me to read, like, just summarize
Sure, yeah,
that.
feel free.
He says it comes from Heidegger, and it's Lacan uses it to talk about an existence which stands apart from. So it insists from the outside, and it's not included on the inside, and it's extimate rather than intimate.
That's great. And this is going to be, and I'm glad you brought that up, especially from Heidegger, because Lacan is going to directly also reference Heidegger in the Purloined Letter as well. And what he's going to be getting out here, and this is why like this first, he's starting strong with this kind of first paragraph, is because the subject in psychoanalysis is a split subject. The subject is not fully the symbolic order, but also not fully not. So just to kind of do that little TLDR, when the mirror stage happens, we have the subject trying to identify and create meaning through language. That's how it works. It's the idea that for me to have meaning, I can kind of, or for me to get meaning, for meaning to be produced, the way that I can understand this existence is through language and how I can talk about things. So the fact that we are having a conversation now, every word that is being said in this conversation, we all kind of know what that word is. So there's some meaning here that's taking place. But the problem is that there's this failure of language to fully give us that all of that meaning because there's this lack. There's something that language cannot fully, get to in terms of subjectivity. For example, if you suffer from PTSD, there's nothing, and I haven't, for example, there's nothing that you could tell me to make me fully understand how you are feeling or to fully understand, PTSD in that way. So language is kind of an imperfect medium. So that means the subject, in part, is produced by this symbolic order, but then there's also something else that we can't fully capture through language and convention and social norms. So when it says existence there, it's really referring to kind of a subject that is kind of on the outside. It lies outside of this self-contained ego that kind of Freud is going to talk about. So in this first paragraph, the subject is shaped by this signifying chain, but it's not conscious that it's shaped by this chain as well. So it's within the symbolic order, but not really aware of it. So that's kind of that. I think we can continue here. The lesson of this seminar is intended to maintain that these imaginary incidences, far from representing the essence of our experience, reveal only what in it remains inconsistent unless they are related to the symbolic chain which binds them and orients them. So here, this is what Lacan is setting down. It's that, let's see here. Sorry, I'm gonna kind of open my notes here. Yeah, here we go. So he does bring up the imaginary here, which is interesting because majority of this work is going to be about the symbolic order. So in the imaginary register, the subject's ego and sense of self is formed through an identification with some type of image. I am a son, I am a daughter, father, so on and so forth. But he's noticing that these imaginary incidences are not our entire essence. He's saying that these identifications are fundamentally based on some deficiency or incompleteness or lack or some fragmented view of the self. So when the subject sees themselves as some whole, it's really a false unity here. It's some idealized projection. So what he's trying to say is our lesson is to kind of look at how this symbolic chain is able to come together and craft this almost illusion or fantasy of wholeness, and how when we understand the symbolic chain more in depth, specifically the place of the letter in Poe's work, we can kind of understand subjectivity better, and in particular, per the first paragraph, we can understand repetition, automatism. So I hope that made sense.
And
Uh,
I do. The Think translation is a little bit different in this one.
okay.
There's a few instead of imaginary sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Instead of imaginary incidences, he says imaginary effects. That one I don't think is all that significant yet, but I think that it could draw something from it, but I don't know if we need to. But instead of reveal only what remains inconsistent, he says it doesn't give us any consistency, which I think is pretty different because he's not saying it reveals inconsistency. He's saying it just does not reveal consistency. I don't
Right.
know. I don't have the French text, so I can't say which is more accurate, but I do think the Fink one is the more standard translation.
Good to know. And what you just said too, if it's not pointing out that kind of inconsistency, then it means we're being tricked in a way, right? Like we don't really know through like these through this like identification through images. We don't really know that we're being, tricked. Like we truly believe that we are whole in the same way that with this letter going back and forth in Poe's work, we'll see that the reader doesn't really maybe know what's going on. As we are reading the prefect of police explaining, we've searched everywhere. We truly believe that the prefect has searched the entire premises. So it's kind of interesting that you bring that up because I think that does make a difference. Yeah.
I I kind of read it in terms of the gap, right? Like the imaginary comes in to both reveal and conceal a gap, I think, which is a problem only insofar as it fails to be related to the symbolic, right? Because what the symbolic does is it takes away that revelation by organizing.
So are you pointing out here, Jack, a type of like tension between the two?
But it's kind of both, curiously enough, right? Like there's a tension, right? And like you're saying, there's a tension within, I think, the sense of like a gap or break, right? But there's also an amending of it, right? Because there's something that I see here where if the symbolic, so like where he says, right, far from representing the essence of our experience, reveal only what in it remains inconsistent. So the imaginary doesn't represent what's critical to our experience. It shows us what's inconsistent with our experiences, unless the symbolic chain orients it, right? So it's almost like there's this problem, but the symbolic, whether or not it conceals the problem, it like convalesces it, right? Like it kind of makes it stop from breaking. It makes the inconsistencies less of an issue because it makes them workable.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I think when we get a little further down here, Jack, I think when they start talking about the letter, the letter is what's going to make this story workable too. And the letter is playing an interesting role because it's kind of kicking the story further and further down the line. There's a repetition to this story. The letter's being stolen, the letter's being found, the letter's being stolen, it's being found again. So what you were saying is interesting there. But then I think what Lacan is going to question though is everything you're saying is right, but in that symbolic chain, you have something that's not signified, which is going to be the letter itself. The letter is a signifier with no signified. So I think everything you're saying is great. And I think Lacan's going to take that and say like where or what is the role of this letter because we don't ever get to read the contents of the letter. Thank you,
I do
Jack.
also I do also think the difference in translation does have some impact on this specifically because it's in fact whether we see the imaginary as being inconsistent or just not having consistency because I don't it's a slight difference but like I don't in my translation at least it's not like there's any sort of inconsistency, it just doesn't get consistency except until it's related to the symbolic chain. I don't know if there's much to draw from that at this point, but
But yeah, no, I mean, and
I
and
just
and
wanted
that's
to bring it up.
I'm very happy that you're bringing up this other reading because I think it's or the other translation. I think it will start to kind of make a
Yeah,
difference too as we're going along. So thanks for
yeah, I
doing
can
that.
send. I know the PDF for the Fink translation is online. You can find it if you just look it
Yeah,
up.
yeah, no, we
But
can find it or you can just throw it in. That's great.
yeah,
Okay, let's do it. Let's continue. We realize, of course, the importance of these imaginary impregnations in those partializations of the symbolic alternative which give the symbolic chain its appearance. But we maintain that it is the specific law of that chain which governs those psychoanalytic effects that are decisive for the subject, such as foreclosure, repression, denial, itself specifying with appropriate emphasis that these effects follow so faithfully the displacement of the signifier that imaginary factors, despite their inertia, figure only as shadows and reflections in the process. So there's a lot going on here. So he's saying that regardless of this imaginary and the influence that the imaginary identifications have on the symbolic, what he's saying is that there's a specific law of the chain right here. And this is going to be important. And this is, I think, what D and G are going to draw from for the disjunctive synthesis, is that there's a law or code that governs this kind of chain. And he highlights here a few kind of psychoanalytic processes, things like foreclosure, repression, and denial. So we can break them down. Foreclosure is going to refer to when a signifier is rejected from the symbolic order. Sometimes, at least from what I can see, this can result in psychosis, as an excluded signifier cannot be part and parcel with the subject's experience, and it might be a very important thing. The other thing is repression, pushing those kind of unwanted, desires or thoughts out of consciousness. And then you have denial as well, when we just refuse to acknowledge a specific sign that is present. So notice that this symbolic chain is going to have a big role in how the subject's symptoms start to appear, or the underlying causes to those symptoms. And it's going to come down to how we kind of interpret this chain or understand this chain. At least that's my take from it. But if anyone wants to continue or give comments, feel free.
The word partialization sticks out a lot because it's not really used in French or in English. The think comment on it is the, let me find it. Where is it? Okay, there. I have been unable to find he said he's unable to find the French word in any dictionary.
Mm,
And it was
course.
found in a 1611 dictionary of French and English, where that defined it as to partialize, side, be partial, or take sides. And it seems like it's mainly about just like taking sides and like partial versus like, I think taking sides is the best way to put it.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of like, in general, at least, I mean, at least with this translation, there's a lot of there's a few words that I was like, what the heck does this mean? I'm glad you bring that up though. Taking sides, because I think the importance of imaginary impregnations in those partial, it's it's interesting. I wonder if he's at all making some claim here regarding, I don't want to say one register being more important, but throughout this seminar, it's going to be kind of all in on the symbolic here. And then on the flip side, when I think of partial, I think of like parts in a way. In the context of the symbolic chain, it's kind of split into various parts, and some signifiers might have more quote unquote importance, as we're going to see like with the letter. So I wonder if they're trying to split it up in that way as well, or he's trying to do that. But I'm not sure. But that's a great comment.
I'll add something there too. You can also read it like you can be partial to something as a kind of preference, as a kind of desire, right? And obviously, impregnation has its sense of kind of fertilization, right? So, I mean, like what I get out of this is the imaginary impregnates the symbolic, but only to give it its appearance, right? So the symbolic chain appears to us as the imaginary impregnations if you read it backwards. The thing I think he's really saying there that's like critical, right? Because he's clear that this is not experience, right? This is not going to give you access to your experience. And that's why it's important. I love Lacan for this. That's why it's important, because it doesn't do that. But in not doing that, right, the appearance of the symbolic chain through the imaginary impregnations is functional through the symbolic, right? So when we get the appearance of whatever images, they fit into a function of foreclosure, a function of repression,
Mm.
or whatever function that will be, right? And I think that's kind of interesting from that standpoint, because if you were going to compare this with DNG, this is what they talk about with the double bind.
So you're bringing together the very uh, intimate relationship between the
It is
yeah,
intimate,
right. I
isn't
mean,
it?
it says impregnation, so a very intimate
Right.
relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic here, and it's almost like this law of the chain or the chain itself. I think if I am picking up what you're laying down, it's almost predetermined and determines in a way how imaginary identifications take place, maybe? Like, if the symbolic chain is structured in a particular way, there might be an imaginary identification of X. And an
Close.
imaginary identification of X implies a structure of the chain as well.
Close. I think put the causality side by side. There are images and there's symbolic functions, right? The images give us the appearance of the symbolic. The function gives us what those images in what the chain itself does, right? And so the appearance fits into the doing, but the appearance gives the doing its appearance, right? Because you've
Mhm.
got this kind of like, and I think Lacan's kind of famous for this. You've got like the imaginary as it pertains to the symbolic, and then you've got the symbolic as it pertains to the imaginary, which is just like a bit of a
And the
cluster
registers are always like,
in and out
they're
of each
always
other.
interrelated, right? Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the impregnates kind of aspect here, because I think that the images of identification, they very much are influenced how signs themselves are interpreted. So to have the image of the mother or the father or whatnot within this imaginary, you have to also have these interpretation of signs in the symbolic that kind of culminate in motherhood or fatherhood or whatever. If that makes sense.
Or
So
their
like,
function, right?
Another word is imaginary captation, you know? So when Lacan talked about like, the narcissistic structure, he talked about the primary narcissism and secondary narcissism. Primary narcissism is that pertain to humans and animals as like, right? Animals, of course, they kind of, get lured by kind of satisfaction, right? But humans have like different thing, which is like they have primary narcissism and secondary narcissism, and the animals kind of use this kind of, you know, it kind of like a it kind of like a tricks to kind of have fulfillment, right? But like humans
mhm.
don't like different. They different. They are like desire for the sake of desire. So it's not about fulfillment, right? It's not about the desire, right? The desire for fulfillment. So they kind of have a unique, different from animal, that they kind of like um this kind of primary narcissism after it's like, you have captation, you know you kind of this like when Lacan said the desire of the individual is the desire of the other, right? Because in secondary narcissism, we kind of like this desire reflected, or kind of like reflected through us, you know through us. It returns, right? And it's not about like fulfillment like animals, right? It's something else. I forgot it, because I used to have a graphical kind of show to illustrate. So maybe I will search about the graphical picture that I kind of screenshotted it, right? To kind of illustrate to you. But sorry about to interrupt, the conversation.
No, no, don't be sorry. I think you're bringing up some interesting points here about like primary and secondary narcissism. I think all of this, for sure, for Lacan, is going to come back to this kind of relationship between,
Mm,
especially with what Jack was saying, for sure, between this relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic
yeah.
here. And I think Jack's comment here makes a lot of sense regarding kind of he's using the example of the mother.
Yeah, you
Mm.
see how like
And by
there's an
and by mhm. And by the way, just to add a little bit, Lacan in the early like seminars, right? He said that we have to look at like psychoanalysis from a scary, scary, stereoscopic view, or like kind of parallax view, right? Where things happening, right? Like something is nothing, but at the same time something is be and not be at the same time. It's kind of like the Hegelian idea of being in a nothing, absence and presence, right? Through absence, like a chiasmic structure, right? Chiasmic structure. That's it.
Nice. I dig it. That tie to Hegel too. That's great. Jack?
yeah, with the example of the mother I'm giving in the chat, it's just to point out that like it's the so like with the inconsistency, right? It's about the difference between the imaginary and the symbolic versus the difference between what they're doing and what's an experience, right? Because what's critical is that it doesn't represent an experience, right? And that's kind of where this follows from, so that you get the sense in which mother can impregnate the chain, the image of mother rather, can impregnate the chain in several different ways, right? And even though that appears as mother based on that impregnation, the function of that appearance in that chain depends on the symbolic, right? So that the impregnation can function in terms of a foreclosure, could function in terms of a denial, right? It could function in terms of a compensation. So you
And
get
that
this
is how
like
the
change.
appearance and that's how the appearance of the symbolic order is shaped too. So like with the mother, there's this image of the mother, for example, like my mother growing up. And then even though I might be affected by various signs or various other images of what motherhood is, there is still that initial image that does impregnate the symbolic chain, sorry. And then that can influence like how I view motherhood even today. So it's like it sounds like it's a question of how the symbolic chain appears to us, and that um, and that's impregnated by imaginary identifications.
And for
Yes.
Lacan, the symbolic chain doesn't come like pre-formed, right? It's formed in the mirror stage or somewhere around those lines. I don't know exactly which stage, but that's something
Yeah,
that's
and
formed
I
through language socially.
well, I think your question is going to get at the crux of the whole piece because that's the question. It's not a fixed chain, right? And kind of like what you're bringing up. You are right though that when you have the infant, um, you're going to. I mean, the example is like the infant doesn't have that kind of doesn't enter the mirror stage. The second they do, they now have to say, "Oh, I am a subject. What does that mean?" And they, have learned language in order to kind of have that type of meaning making. And through that process, the symbolic chain is always in a state of flux for Lacan. It's always changing. So, so yeah, I think you're right there that it's not just there. It's something that is consistently formed as one enters the mirror stage. And through the passing of the letter, we're going to see that that's the letter is a pure signifier. We're going to see how that is necessary to continue kicking that can further down the road to allow the symbolic chain to kind of change too. Because without that pure signified, everything would be fixed. And for Lacan, things cannot be fixed, because the whole kind of point is that language is an imperfect modality. There is no semiotic utopia that can kind of tell us and give us that full meaning through language. So that there's something there with the letter. So I think sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a spiel. I just think that your question is like asking something very good.
Real quick though, I wanted to come back to your comment on the imaginary. Yes to the appearance, but we have to qualify it because the appearance doesn't have something innate to it, right? What the appearance does depends on the symbolic. Because I think that's the real trick to it, is that the image of mother is an appearance, right? It's how something looks. But however something looks changes.
Mhm.
So that the appearance of mother changes, for instance. At the same time, the function of it is all changing based on how the symbolic alters it, right? So that the same image of mother can appear differently while also functioning differently, right? So he's creating variability in appearance and in functionality.
Good, and I'm glad you're bringing that up, because it's almost like the way that I was describing it was like a fixed image, right? And he's very much saying that these things are also more have more variability.
The word they use for appearance also translates to speed, pace, gait, cadence, distinction, style, class, and in the context of sailing, trim. So I think that also fits in perfectly with this.
No, that's great. Yeah, so no, that's perfect. I think all of that's going to be getting at something a more kind of an influx in a way. Okay, let's do it. But this emphasis would be lavished in vain if it served, in your opinion, only to abstract a general type from phenomena whose particularity in our work would remain the essential thing for you, and whose original arrangement could be broken up only artificially. I wish Lacan wrote a little cleaner, but here he's saying that we need to be conducting a very thorough analysis here, um, regarding rather than something that's like too broad, because he's going to want to be really getting at how particular forms of analysis, at least from how I read it, uncover repetition kind of automatism. And in this case, the way that he's going to do it is going to be through, obviously, a story or the Purloined Letter. I think that this kind of sentence here is just kind of like a kind of a little transition into why I think this is just a little bit of a transition here.
There are a couple translation differences that I noticed. So instead of abstracting a general type, the Think translation says abstract a general form, which I think seems to get at it a little more. But I don't have the original French to see which is more accurate. And then instead of original arrangement, it's original composite nature, which I think is
Hmm.
that is pretty different, which I think is
Hmm.
worth noting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's continue. Which is why we have decided to illustrate for you today the truth which may be drawn from that moment in Freud's thought under study, namely that it is the symbolic order which is constitutive for this subject, by demonstrating in a story the decisive orientation which the subject receives from the itinerary of a signifier. So in the specific signifier here, um, the specific signifier here, right here at the end where he says from the itinerary of a signifier, is going to play a key role in the development of the subject, the quote, the decisive orientation. I yeah, that's the way that I read this sentence. Just saying that, yeah, that's the way that I read this sentence. Just saying that there's going to be some specific thing that kind of shapes the subject's development, and we're going to get at what that sort of thing is. And he says, which is why we decided to illustrate for you today. And I don't know if that word illustrate is there, but I think clearly illustrate, we're going to be dealing with, the story. Okay.
So I think the itinerary of a signifier, I think it really implies that the signifier is doing it by itself rather than through any signified. It's not the content that matters, it's the form of the signifier itself.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting that it says the itinerary, because when you look at like an itinerary of anything, it's more setting out the map rather than the individual event, right? Like if you have like an itinerary for a trip somewhere, we're not focusing itself on the content of the restaurant or the hotel or anything. It's just setting out that map. So I think that's actually a really good point here, that it's a signifier without the signified, that there's not going to be as much of an importance there.
Yeah, but to that I'd say too, like, yeah, so Lacan's not as interested in the signifieds, right? Like he's not so sure. But I think too with this point about the itinerary of the signifier, right? Like he's talking about that symbolic functionality that gives this, that if I follow him correctly, is giving the signifier like what it can do, right, in order to constitute the subject.
So you're saying the extent that the signifier, you're saying the extent of the function of the signifier.
To speak of the itinerary of the signifier is to require the symbolic function, right?
Hmm.
It brings that last sentence we were talking about into it.
Yeah, yeah, I completely see what you mean here. Because we're gonna get to the place, like the letter and its hiding place throughout the Purloined Letter. The hiding place also, is going to play a role too. And I think with what you're saying, it's like its functionality is going to be determined also by where it is at in the chain. At least it's kind of what I picked up from what you just said, Jack.
Yeah, how it functions at a symbolic level is going to come into the chain, right? So that when it moves physically, it can change functionality so that in this arrangement, we'll say it can function in terms of repression, but in another arrangement, it can function in terms of compensation, right? Because
Oh,
a lot of
or
like,
like foreclosure denial.
absolutely,
Right. So it's how
exactly.
it's function. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, when we deal with the signifier, we've got to deal with the symbolic function. Otherwise, we just have the signifier, right?
I like it. That's clean. Okay. Thanks, Jack. It is that truth, let us note, which makes the very existence of fiction possible. And in that case, a fable is as appropriate as any other narrative for bringing it to light, at the risk of having the fable's coherence put to the test in process. Aside from that reservation, a fictive tale even has the advantage of manifesting symbolic necessity more purely to the extent that we may believe its conception arbitrary. So now I really like how we're transitioning here to the work itself. So he kind of set that foundation, which I appreciate. It's like, okay, he threw it all at the wall, and now we're going to kind of go through the story here in general. So without this symbolic framework in the way that Jack was discussing, fiction wouldn't exist. But part of me questions like why a little bit in particular, because it's also that in a way nonfiction wouldn't exist either, right? Like because that's also through a symbolic framework. So I think that he's just trying to do a transition here, unless anyone thinks that there's something more with that first sentence.
I don't think it's like one of the most important things for us to focus on, but I think that he's emphasizing fiction specifically because it's about storytelling and rather than just about communication in general and how like we like narrativizing and fantasy, I think, play into it. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but maybe that was helpful.
Yeah, maybe that unlike something like nonfiction, there's just a lot more room for interpretation of maybe what the symbolic chain is looking like, or how to interpret it, right? Because he does say that, quote, a fable, as we read it, has a risk to it, and it's where its coherence is put to the test. So though a story can be an effective tool to teach us something, it also means that the fable can be tested because there might be inherent flaws that make no sense that within it. So he doesn't want to get too lost in the details here, as he says, aside from that reservation, right? So he just says that examining these stories can kind of allow us to explore meaning without having to be confined to reality in a way. Which is
Yeah.
why, without seeking any further, we have chosen our example from the very story in which the dialectic of the game of even or odd, from whose study we have but recently profited, occurs. It is no doubt no accident that this tale revealed itself propitious, am I saying that right? To pursuing a course of inquiry which has already found support in it. I wonder if I took a note there. I don't think I did. So the reason why Lacan is choosing this specific story from what he's saying is because of the game of even or odd. In this game, you have two. I mean, I think if you read the Purloined Letter, you should know. But in case we don't, um the game of even or odd is when you have two kind of players, and then like on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, they put out a number like that, right? So if I'm even, my opponent is odd. You go 1, 2, 3, and then it's like this. Well, there's 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means I would get a point. And then you play again, and then you do a different number. That's 3. So then odd would win. So he's going to be demonstrating through the use of this game of even or odd why the symbolic chain is structured in the way that it is, and it's going to be doing something very, I don't know, fascinating there.
It
And
seems a
in a
little bit.
way,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
No, you can continue.
I guess I'm a little bit suspicious of this premise of extrapolating like a signifying chain from an individual story. It seems like if you could find another story that has a different like logic to it and how it represents the unconscious or how the symbolic functions, that you could come away with a different reading of the symbolic. So
In
does that make sense?
Like, yeah, so what you're saying is like, well, you could theoretically do a psychoanalytic reading of any kind of literature, right? And that you can kind of take away your own interpretation of the symbolic chain and it could be very different from the Purloined Letter. Like if we read Harry Potter, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a great comment.
especially
He
if
does
we're
sort
if we're actually trying to learn about the signifying chain from it.
he does
Sorry, go
also
ahead.
does later sort of explain why this text specifically is so great for this. Like it's not. I don't think I haven't read the whole thing, but from what I've read, he hasn't done like a thorough justification. But he does like frequently point out why this specific text is more relevant than others.
Yeah.
It fits within
But I
his signifying chains or whatever. Anyway, just being uh,
yeah,
a
but
little
I also
obnoxious, but
I also think that's kind of the point though, right? Because the signifying chains don't have an inherent essence that they're functioning through, right? Like there's no inherent, if you want to say it in a straight way, there's no inherent meaning. So when you're moving
yeah,
across, when you're dealing with something like a story, right? And you're getting different scenes, so to speak, you're tracking how the symbolic is changing its functionality and how the imaginary is changing in the impregnation of appearances, right? So like
okay,
I think that dynamism is like critical. Otherwise, we would have to kind of say that, the and I think he throws this out about a sentence or two ago. Like, we're not trying to get at the essence of repression itself. We're trying to track how it kind of varies among things, how it like morphs.
Okay, that's interesting. So he's going for more of like a trying to get at a read at it almost like at a level of deriving it from how it's affecting how the symbolic chain affects the story.
I think it's going to be something like how the functionality changes for the chain, right?
Okay,
So
yeah,
like the
much better
letter can
wording.
be repressive here. The letter could be compensatory here, right? The symbolic is changing the function of the chain,
Okay,
even
that
though
makes a lot more
the
sense.
letter is the same.
I mean, I do think though, August, you're bringing up kind of like a general point, which some people be critical of, psychoanalysis for. It's like you can psychoanalyze anything, and I think what makes this story particularly unique is that, and what he will be getting at is that we never read what the letter is. And it's kind of we could talk, we could have a whole reading itself on Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter and have many interpretations about it. What does the letter say? Why is the queen so afraid of that information getting out? And I think because of that, Lacan is able to use this as just a very clean example of a signifier without a signified, which other stories will have, you know, but it's not going to be as maybe clear. And I think what Jack said, it's like not dependent on the story. For Lacan, the symbolic chain is going to be the same no matter kind of what, but in this story, it shows much more cleanly. I hope that makes sense, August.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
Okay. As you know, we are talking about the tale which Baudelaire has translated under the title La Lettre Volée. At first reading, we may distinguish a drama, its narration, and the conditions of that narration. So, to just be very clear, there's a translation, and Lacan does reference the various words that Baudelaire uses um, throughout. So one of the words is going to be like odd. There's not like a very proper translation of the word odd for French or something. So Baudelaire has to be kind of creative with a little bit of the translation. So at first he's saying when so that's kind of what he's saying here with the translation question. Now, in terms of when we read it, when you first read this, it's very kind of clear that you can distinguish various parts. You can distinguish a drama here, um, how it's being narrated, and how the conditions of that narration are taking place. Like if you remember, um, the 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 narrator is with the French. I'm sorry, it's Dupin. Um, the narrator is with Dupin in that little small book library thing, and that's going to also kind of play a role here for interpreting the story about like the conditions in which the narrator is in and which the other characters are in as well.
I think it's Dupont.
Dupont. Yeah, I have literally looked it up multiple times, and every time I'm just so embarrassed because my French is terrible. Dupont. Okay. We see quickly enough, moreover, that these components are necessary and that they could not have escaped the intentions of whoever composed them. The narration, in fact, doubles the drama with a commentary, without which no mise en scène would be possible. Let us say that the action would remain, properly speaking, invisible from the pit, aside from the fact that the dialogue would be expressly and by dramatic necessity devoid of whatever meaning it might have for an audience. In other words, nothing of the drama could be grasped, neither seen nor heard, without, dare we say, the twilighting which the narration in each scene casts on the point of view that one of the actors had while performing it. So we're setting the stage here. We're setting the stage here. This isn't where he discusses the two scenes, but he is discussing here the mise en scene or the story has been set up, and that with this particular narration, we're not only telling the events of the story, but rather the narrator being there with Dupont and, the prefect. I think that what Lacan is saying is that the narration itself allows there to be kind of a doubling of the drama. We're not just hearing this story out there away from us, we are being told this story. So without being told this story, there's no mise en scene for this particular piece. I think that's what he's saying.
I do want to read the last sentence from my translation because it's very different, like much more significant than the other ones. So it's after the colon. In my version, it's a period. In your version, it's a colon.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, nothing of the drama could appear, either in the framing of the images or the sampling of the sounds, without the oblique light shed, so to speak, on each scene by the narration from the point of view that one of the actors had while playing his role in it. Which, if the twilighting is not here, it's like the oblique light shed is the word that the terminology is used here, which I think is a little more accurate for what Lacan is trying to do, because it's like all about looking at things from like I'm blanking on the word.
No, yeah, oblique light shed versus
Parallax.
twilighting. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of point you bring here. Um, I think you're right. I don't think it takes too much away from the question about why like the narration itself is important or why it doubles the drama. But I think that you're right that the language here definitely has some sort of kind of implication. Now,
Also, sorry,
yeah.
nothing. Mine says nothing could appear. Yours says nothing could be grasped. I do think that has a little more relevance for narration and the effect that narration has on the audience. I think because one's talking more about what's present in the story, one's talking about how we understand it.
Yeah, like especially here, right? Invisible from the pit. So think about at a concert hall or if, when you go to watch a theater. If you're kind of in the pit, you're there at the kind of bottom and you're not going to see, what's going on unless it's very clear like up front about what's happening. So I think without proper narration, we are not able to see, or it might not appear right um, from that audience perspective. I think maybe you're right there about why appear could be better. Okay, let's continue here. There are two scenes. The first of which we shall straightway designate the primal scene, and by no means inadvertently, since the second may be considered its repetition in the very sense we are considering today. So this story is not existing in a single scene. We are going to be illustrating the story to show that there's a primal scene and a secondary repetition, and this will be kind of the crux here. So now we're going to move on to what is this primal scene. So we have a primal scene here and second here. Okay. The primal scene is thus performed, we are told, and I'm not going to pronounce this, in the royal boudoir, so that we suspect that the person of the highest rank, called the exalted personage, who is alone there when she receives a letter, is the queen. The queen gets the letter. This feeling is confirmed by the embarrassment into which she is plunged by the entry of the other exalted personage, of whom we have already been told prior to this account that the knowledge he might have of the letter in question would jeopardize for the lady nothing less than her honor and safety. Any doubt that he is in fact the king is promptly dissipated in the course of the scene, which begins with the entry of the minister D. At that moment, in fact, the queen can do no better than to play on the king's inattentiveness by leaving the letter on the table face down, address uppermost. It does not, however, escape the minister's lynx, I should say lynx there, minister's lynx eye, nor does he fail to notice the queen's distress and thus to fathom her secret. From then on, everything transpires like clockwork. After dealing in his customary manner with the business of the day, the minister draws from his pocket a small letter in appearance to the one in his view, and having pretended to read it, he places it next to the other. A bit more conversation to amuse the royal company, whereupon, without flinching once, he seizes the embarrassing letter, making off with it, as the queen, on whom none of his maneuver had been lost, remains unable to intervene for fear of attracting the attention of her royal spouse, close at her side at that very moment. Everything might then have transpired unseen by a hypothetical spectator of an operation in which nobody falters, and whose quotient is that the minister has filched from the queen her letter, and that, an even more important result than the first, the queen knows that he now has it, and by no means innocently. A remainder that no analyst will neglect, trained as he is to retain whatever is significant, without always knowing what to do with it. The letter, abandoned by the minister, in which the queen's hand is now free to roll into a ball. So let's kind of pause here before the second scene. This first scene, this primal scene, is where the first theft of the letter and, in a way, the concealment of the letter takes place. So we see that the queen gets this letter and is embarrassed by it. And there, you can interpret this however you want. Someone knows some type of secret or something along the lines, and she has this letter, and it can't get out. As she gets this letter and is in shock and awe, the king and the king and Minister D walk in. She clearly doesn't want to draw attention to the letter, so she just leaves it out, because if you leave it out, no one's going to question it. If she's trying to hide it, someone's going to question it. And then Minister D is able to kind of notice with his lynx eye. Lynx have like a keen perception, I guess. And then there you have it. It's taken. What do you all think maybe this means? Like a remainder that no analyst will neglect? I wonder if this is like talking about some residue or like something else here, because I read that and I saw a remainder, and I was wondering if that meant something to anyone, or if I'm maybe reading too much into it, ironically enough.
The remainder, I think, is the letter.
Okay.
Like that's it's the remainder is the letter, but also that sentence is different in mine, and this is another one that I think is significant. It says, a remainder that no analyst will neglect, trained as he is to remember everything having to do with the signifier, even if he does not know what to do with it. And I don't know why they would change that to, or why whatever. Sorry, I'm. Give me a second. Okay. Yeah, it's whatever is significant in your translation, anything having to do with the signifier in my translation. That is very different, and
Yeah.
also extremely significant, because this is all about the signifier. So
It's significant, right? Yeah, that's really weird. That's really weird. I wonder why that's changed there. But notice though that it's not the letter that the queen had that's the remainder. It's the letter abandoned by the minister here. So regardless of how the psychoanalyst chooses to interpret that remainder, there's now a remainder, right? So it exists. There's something that is symbolic of of something not being resolved. So something is left behind by the minister. It's like that fake letter, like a decoy or whatever. And that proves that I don't know, I was thinking maybe unresolved repression or something. I mean, there's a lot of ways to kind of interpret it, and I think I don't know, I felt that it was important because maybe now, because of that remainder, it makes me think of a place in the symbolic chain now that doesn't have some type of signified. I don't know. Maybe I might be reading too much into it, but yeah, very very interesting point here about significant versus signifier. Owen, I think Owen Lilly. Okay, second scene. That's the first scene. The second scene in the minister's office. It is in his hotel, and we know from the account the prefect of police has given Dupont, whose specific genius for his solving enigmas Poe introduces here for the second time, that the police, returning there as soon as the minister's habitual nightly absences allow them to, have searched the hotel and its surroundings from the top to the bottom for the last 18 months. In vain, although everyone can deduce from the situation that the minister keeps the letter within reach. So those are the kind of two scenes. You have the one where there's the minister taking the letter, replacing it with some kind of decoy-ish one. And then you have the prefect of police consistently searching. And it's not just once that the prefect searches, but twice, right? After Dupont gives the kind of green light to say, go search again. And I love how Poe describes the search. It's just so fun, like using microscopes and whatnot. Okay, I think we all get that.
But
Dupont,
before you
yeah.
move on, I think like with the remainder in that, like I think the thing that's being said there is that what's what's enigmatic, right? If we want to use Lacan's term there, is that having taken the letter, it's left in reach of the queen. If I follow him correctly in the previous, in what he's saying in the residual, right? The letter abandoned by the minister, in which the queen's hand is now free to roll into a ball, right? The minister lets it go, and the queen can take it. Because I think, like with that last part, what's doubled is the sense in which the minister keeps it in reach, and yet it seems to be let go, right? I think the sense of doubling is kind of getting built out there. And I think that remainder is getting pushed out because, well, he says he doesn't know why it's getting pushed out, right? But I think that's the trick because that makes it, if I follow him correctly, repeatable or like alterable.
Hmm. So you think that this remainder, a big part of it is that the queen has seen this unfold and is like, shoot, he took my letter, replaced it with a letter. So the remainder or the doubling is the fact that there are two letters for you? Is that what you're saying?
No, that the letter has been abandoned by the minister, and yet at the same time the queen can reach her hand out and take the letter and roll it into a ball, right? There's this sense in which it's given up and can be taken forth. And that sense plays a dual role, right? That plays a kind of, we'll say, physical role in the primal story, and that'll play a narrative role in the secondary story. It can be taken,
Oh,
and yet
interesting.
but
Interesting.
it's the second time, right? It's the minister's abandonment having taken the letter, right?
No, that's interesting, and I like how you kind of made that. Uh, you highlighted the two different kind of scenes with this kind of remainder. I mean, in a way, that this marks a transition too, right? Like for the story, because now the queen can now take it, roll it into a ball out of frustration. So, like you said, there's like a leaving and also a taking there too. And I think the leaving of something and the taking of it. I mean, this is just emblematic of the whole story.
Exactly. It opens itself up to different iterations of itself.
Cool. I love it. Let's do it. Let's move on. Jack, do you know what this word is here?
That is ennui.
Ennui.
It's like a listlessness.
Okay. Dupont calls on the minister. The latter receives him with studied nonchalance, affecting in his conversation romantic ennui. I literally looked that one up too, by the way, and I just forgot how to pronounce it. Meanwhile, Dupont, whom this pretense does not deceive, his eyes protected by green glasses, proceeds to inspect the premises. When his glance catches a rather crumpled piece of paper, apparently thrust carelessly into a division of an ugly pasteboard card rack, hanging gaudily from the middle of the mantelpiece, he already knows that he's found what he's looking for. His conviction is reinforced by the very details which seem to contradict the description he has of the stolen letter, with the exception of the format, which remains the same. So I think we've read the story here, so we don't have to go too much. But yes, the minister ends up, Minister D ends up Dupont ends up taking the minister's letter, which is just left out in plain sight. Whereupon he has but to withdraw after forgetting his snuff box on the table, in order to return the following day to reclaim it, armed with a facsimile, right? Is that I always forget how to pronounce that one too, of the
Oh, you
letter
got it.
in its present state. As an incident in the street prepared for the proper moment draws the minister to the window, Dupin in turn seizes the opportunity to snatch the letter while substituting the imitation and has only to maintain the appearances of a normal exit. So I made a mistake earlier saying he takes the letter. He finds the letter here. And Jack, this is again like that kind of dual thing in a way for all of them. It's like they might see it and then, take it, leave something behind in a way, right? And that's what Dupin does here as well. He says he intentionally forgets something after meeting with the minister, leaves, and then is like, "Oh, I have to come back and pick this thing up again," and then he can switch out, the decoy, with the decoy letter.
Right.
In a
He
way, another
takes it.
remainder.
Right. He takes it, and in taking it, he abandons it. And yet, at the same time, for the other person, it's always within reach, right? And that's actually one of the frustrating things about like what Dupin does here, right? Is everybody's certain that it's always within reach. They just can't locate where it is. It's the same thing as the beginning of the story. The king could just pick the letter up, but he doesn't. But
Or like,
that he can, I
yeah,
think, is the significance.
Hmm.
Go ahead.
Rosen was hired in the first place was they just find the letter. They like within the context of the story, they claimed that they like completely tore apart his bed frame and every piece of furniture and everything and couldn't find the letter. But it was lying on his letter rack.
Yeah,
Always within reach,
it's
right?
always within reach. Yeah, like the
Yep,
king,
it's
it's always
always within
within
reach.
reach. Yeah, and then there's that remainder too. So it's like there's always that decoy in reach too. And even when Dupin has the letter himself, and the prefect is like, "Man, I would pay anyone any amount of money or whatever to that letter." The letter's still within reach. It's like right in front of. It's right under. It's right in front of him. I mean, it always reminds me of just like, I'll have like my glasses on or like my car keys in my pocket, and like, where are my glasses? Where are my car keys or whatever, and it's just right there. So that's yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I think we can continue here. Here, as well, all has transpired, if not without noise, at least without any commotion. The quotient of the operation is that the minister no longer has the letter, but far from suspecting that Dupin is the culprit who has ravished it from him, knows nothing of it. Moreover, what he is left with is far from insignificant for what follows. We shall return to what brought Dupin to inscribe a message on his counterfeit letter. Whatever the case, the minister, when he tries to make use of it, will be able to read these words, written so that he may recognize Dupin's hand. And then I'm not going to try this one. Out of curiosity, Owen, is this in yours?
It's from the original story, but it's one second. Let me look at it for a second. It's not quite formatted the same, and it's in a different part of the sentence. It's like just like
Okay.
grammatical difference, but like it is in there. I
Okay.
have
Okay.
I have a translation if you want that too.
Yeah, no, I was wondering because I have one too, and I just wanted to see.
Yeah, it's let me find it. So fatal a scheme, if not worthy of Atreus, is worthy of Thyestes.
Yeah. Okay. I have a fatal design, if not worthy of Atreus, is worthy of Thyestes. So
Yeah,
yeah. So
I have
I'm
the footnote also includes like a explanation of it. It's refers to Atreus' plan to take revenge on his brother Thyestes, who had stolen his wife from him some 20 years earlier by serving him his own son blood to drink.
hmm.
And that's also in the Purloined Letter, the quote.
No, yeah. That's what Dupin writes on it, right? And
Yeah,
and that's it's interesting though.
it does say that. I'm not paying attention.
Knowing the backstory though, it's interesting because it sounds like the story that this is coming from sounds very it sounds like there's a lot of revenge happening. It sounds like there's a lot of turmoil or anger for years and years and years, and then pulling this kind of thing. I wonder why Dupin is using this one, right? Lacan doesn't say why. Whose source Dupin tells us is Crébillon's Attrait. So kind of interesting.
On it, like what he's got in the doubling is a form of drama combined with narration, right? So usually in drama uh you don't have a first person, third person narrator, right? You have events unfolding, and in Greece you would have a chorus, right? And that's not really a narrator. Um, but what's important for Lacan is that the dramaturgical and the narrative are being brought together through fiction, right? So, and that's why he keeps going back to these plays, because what Poe does, right, is this is an inscription from a play, which to me, I take it as less about revenge, perhaps, because I don't know that they established the motive of the man taking the letter, but I took it in terms of like Thyestes. I'm sorry, Atreus would not do this, but Thyestes would, right? Like it says something about who you are to take on such a baleful scheme, right?
But
And there's this like
both of them did.
comparison. Such a baleful scheme, while not worthy of Atreus, is worthy of Thyestes. They take on different schemes, right?
I mean, yeah, maybe Dupont's point is, well, I would have never taken it from the queen like you. Like you know, you're selfish, you're rude, so I'm gonna steal it back. You know, like it's like that. So I'm gonna steal it back, and it's almost like Dupont here is making kind of. I mean, he ends up giving the letter to the prefect, right? So it ends up coming full circle in this story. So so maybe Atreus here, you know, maybe I see what you're saying. Maybe it's less about revenge because obviously we don't know the motive, but more about the kind of relationship to the schemes themselves.
Right? Because we could also, and in some ways, to your point, we could suggest that perhaps the minister wanted to sell the letter, right? Or at least he has the capacity to sell the letter. Dupin sells the letter, right?
Yeah, I know
So like
he
he
sells it
sells the
for
letter.
yeah, for a price, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
he doesn't return it. He sells it, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like a thief.
yeah, but for him, at least from what he wrote here, he has some moral righteousness going on, you
There's
know?
a
So
kind
it's
of
like,
irony to it, though,
yeah, it's
right?
a little ironic. Okay, let us continue. Need we emphasize the similarity of these two sequences? Yes, for the resemblance we have in mind is not a simple collection of traits chosen only in order to delete their difference. And it would not be enough to retain those common traits at the expense of the others for the slightest truth to result. It is rather the intersubjectivity in which the two actions are motivated that we wish to bring into relief, as well as the three terms through which it structures them. So, between the two sequences, right, or between the two scenes that Lacan has uh, laid out, it is evident that a letter has been stolen. So there is a similarity. But Lacan is making an argument here that we should just go beyond that simple resemblance, right? And he's saying that the deeper truth of this is not just a surface level analysis. And this is where he's going to talk about intersubjectivity. Now, I think this is where we're going to get to a lot of the bread and the butter of this piece. It's that there is going to be a relationship between subjects that is going to affect how or to affect the appearance of the symbolic chain. And we're gonna get to this more later on, but intersubjectivity here is just going to be that the way that characters are kind of shaped and produced in a way by their relationships with each other. So the queen is shaped by the king, the minister, so on and so forth. The minister is shaped by so on and so forth. And what he also says here, though, is he says in which the two actions are motivated that we wish to bring into relief. So he's saying that we should really analyze the underlying intentions that these characters have. And as we kind of just talked about with this quote, we're already seeing that there's underlying intentions uh, between the characters and how they differ. So I really think that intersubjectivity here is a point that he's trying to make, or like that's the strong point here.
I agree with you. Intersubjectivity takes the critical mass. I think that that first point gives it set up, right? So like we could look at basically what he's interested in is like a form of parallelism, right? There's from a literary perspective. But what he says, right, is I'm not interested in terms of how similar they are. I'm interested in their similarity by way of their difference. And I think that is the trick to the intersubjectivity, because one way of understanding that point is we're not looking for how the symbolic must function, we're looking at how the symbolic changes in function. And in doing so, right, we're talking about how intersubjectivity by way of subjects is altered through the relationship of difference.
Well, and that's the symbolic chain, right? And for Deleuze and Guattari's second synthesis too, we're going to be, I mean, and I'm sure, Jack, you can see the connective synthesis here too, right? Through intersubjectivity. But with the disjunctive synthesis, it is defined, machines are defined by their relation and difference to one another as well through an inclusive disjunction. A dog, let's take a symbolic chain. A dog is not a cat. A dog is not an elephant. A dog is not a book. A dog is not a Discord server. And then we can kind of conclude like what dog is. So I think a little bit here is that through this intersubjectivity and relation between, uh, sorry, it says your stream is still running. We pause this. Oh, okay. So I think through this intersubjectivity here, we note that differences arise. So I think that it's ironic again that he's pointing out a resemblance through difference, if that makes sense.
That's the trick. The resemblance, the mirroring, if you like, if you want to. And I always hate that because that's a loaded term for Lacanian discourse. But the resemblance, the reflection, it's not by way of similarity, it's by way of difference to develop the similarity. Like it's what Foucault says in Order of Things, but for our purposes here, right, what he emphasizes is the resemblance is not to delete the difference. So the primal story and the secondary story vary in their parallelism, and that's the trick to the intersubjectivity. Because if they matched, I don't think he'd be interested in it.
I agree. No, this is good. I'm gonna actually highlight that there because I think you're right. Okay, my goal, by the way, August, was to just get to this right here because this is what defines repetition automatism. So we're not that far. If you need to leave, no worries. I just want to get here because I'm trying to pace the reading out myself, right? So feel free. I'll upload the recording if you need to catch up. It's probably going to be only like 15, 20 more minutes. Okay, so I totally understand if you need a dip. Thanks for joining. Okay, let's do it. The special status of these terms results from their corresponding I'll start over, sorry. The special status of these terms results from their corresponding simultaneously to the three logical moments through which the decision is precipitated, and the three places it assigns to the subjects among whom it constitutes a choice. Let's see what I noted here. I don't think I wrote too much here. I think, yeah, I didn't really have any particular comment here. It's just that what we were kind of talking about earlier, it's that the characters and their relations are defined by their differences to one another. And I think that he's just kind of saying that through the moments in which the letter is stolen or the terms present in the story.
Yeah, he's giving a structure to each side of it. So in the primal, we could say, well, let me be careful here. He's saying the structure that we'll find as we jump between these. One portion of the one structure is the three terms. The other structure is the three logical moments. And the three places it assigns to the subject, right? This is gonna change as we if I understand like where he's going with this, it's going to change as you move between stories. But the structurality is kind of like instead of a narrative structure, we have this kind of like I don't know, this kind of psychoanalytic structure to I don't want to say explain, but to guide the story.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's going to be a question of how I think it's going to be a question of how each scene goes to the next. And I think there's a
Well
reason
said.
why he's talking about kind of a sequential order. You have the primal and then the secondary. And we see this in Freud, uh, primary repression, secondary repression. Like we see this happening. And I think that's why setting the stage for the minister initially taking the letter from the queen, right? We're setting this primal scene. And then from there, we're going to see other interpretive things or interpretations, I guess, of what this all looks like. So I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that he's really going to be getting at like the first scene, as we kind of went over, is more like very kind of strict, or there's some strictness or rigidity to it. Whereas I think that the second scene is going to be a bit more interpretive, or a little more fluid. Okay.
Nice catch on primal and secondary. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're good there. Let's move on to the glance. The decision is reached in a glance's time. For the maneuvers which follow, however stealthily they prolong it, add nothing to that glance, nor does the deferring of the deed in the second scene break the unity of that moment. This glance presupposes two others, which it embraces in its vision of the breach left in their fallacious complementarity, anticipating in it the occasion for larceny afforded by that exposure. Thus, three moments, structuring three glances, borne by three subjects, incarnated each time by different characters. The first is a glance that sees nothing, the king and the police. The second, a glance which sees that the first sees nothing and deludes itself as to the secrecy of what it hides, the queen, then the minister. The third sees that the first two glances leave what should be hidden exposed to whoever would seize it, the minister, and finally, Dupont. I love how he says the decision is reached in a glance's time, because the decision to take the letter, hide the letter, whatever, occurs through some level of observation or perception. We now have this letter entering. I think we can say entering this kind of symbolic chain when we have the minister noticing the letter on the queen's table and also seeing that and immediately seeing that, thinking, I'm going to steal this and I'm going to take this for myself. So these glances, when we have a glance that sees nothing, or a glance that sees something, or a glance that sees the failures of all of the other two glances, I think what Lacan is trying to get at is these three kind of subjects in a way, or these three glances are all interrelated to some extent. And what's present in each glance is the purloined letter. It is the letter that's being passed through, um, concealed, and then uh, stolen and found over and over and over again, which is keeping the story going. At least that's how I read it.
The reference to the glance is also referring to another one of the essays in the book, Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty. I haven't read it. I might read it soon and see if there's anything to draw from that, but that's if I have time for it.
Cool. I had no idea. I mean, there is a little footnote here. Or a note. I haven't really gone through all the endnotes yet, but I'm glad you mentioned that because
Yeah, that is the
yeah,
footnote. It's just
yeah. Well, you know what, Owen? I can kind of tell though that it's important because a lot of these sentences are just like longer than they need to be for Lacan. So notice how it's just so concise here that the decision is reached in a glance's time. I think that there is some importance here, and it makes sense that it's drawing from something else.
Dude. So first of all, so for you, Owen, it's unanticipated certainty, right? You gotta read it and see if there's anything to draw from it. But besides that, uh, yeah, that's what he's talking about there. That's what I mean about like, it's not narrative structure in a traditional sense for Lacan, right? Because he's trying to do a psychoanalytic structure. But that's what I think he's working out there, right? Is like, it's not about the characters, it's about the subjects for whom, it's not about the characters, it's about the subjects, which each character transitions in and out of such a subject, right? They can occupy one subject, then they occupy another subject, right? That's the, because remember, part of the symbolic function is organization,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's kind of what he's getting at here, in part, is the sense of organizing, but more critically, right? The organization depends on, three threes, right? Depends on the threes of subjectivity, depends on the threes of the glance, and there was a third one, but my friend, you scrolled down on me. The three places of the signs. That was it. So,
I would be hesitant a little though, Jack, because what I'm nervous about is that we can't view the symbolic chain as fixed.
I don't. I don't think. I'm not saying we would, but I'm saying there's a structure that he's putting in relation to the chain. I think.
No, I agree. And I think what he's going to be getting at, though, is that if there is no letter here, right? Though remember, we don't know what the letter is. So in each of these glances, in all three, within the three subjects, the three moments, we don't know what the letter is. So I think what he's going to be saying is what prevents the symbolic order or the symbolic chain from being fixed is going to be how this letter is placed in in each scene and how it goes through each scene, always being concealed, always being stolen, always being concealed, being found, being stolen, but we never know what it is. So I just wanted to add like a, what is it, like a caveat to what you're saying. That's all.
Yeah. Put it in relation to the structures, right? People occupy different subject. So characters as a form of people, right? People occupy different subjectivities in part in relation to the letter, right? As the letter changes throughout the course of events, he gave us earlier that sequencing, right? The subjectivities are moved in and out of.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I think that this is the crux of the piece. I mean, we're going to end here where we
Yes.
get the definition of repetition automatism. So we're getting close to like how subjectivity is structured for Lacan. We're getting very close to why a subject might repeat unconscious behaviors. Why does a subject check their locks on their doors repeatedly without being kind of conscious of it? Why do people do these things? And I think the reason why is that these things aren't fixed even if they appear fixed. These scenes themselves aren't fixed. The symbolic order isn't because of that letter in the story. At least that's the way that I read it. This next section here I really like a lot because he does a cool play on words here. So, Jack, would you mind if we move on? Anyone else?
That works for me.
In order to grasp in its unity the intersubjective complex thus described, we would willingly seek a model in the technique legendarily attributed to the ostrich, that should say ostrich, attempting to shield itself from danger. For that technique might ultimately be qualified as political, divided as it here is among three partners. The second believing itself invisible, because the first had its head stuck in the ground, and all the while letting the third calmly pluck its rear. We need only enrich its proverbial denomination by a letter, producing la politique de l'austrich, for the ostrich itself to take on forever a new meaning. So the kind of, I don't know if it's real, but when an ostrich is in danger, it puts its head in the sand. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure that's kind of like not true, but I don't know. But when an ostrich is in danger, it puts its head in the sand and it's not aware of its surroundings. So for each of these scenes, you know, the king and the prefect of police, they don't see the letter. Even though it's right in front of them. For the king, the letter's on the table and he just is hanging out with the queen. For the prefect of police, he's searching everywhere with microscopes, trying to find this letter, has like a fleet, you know, searching everywhere twice and can't find the letter, even though it's right there. I think in the second glance, when we have the queen and the minister, they see that the first clans can't find it. The queen notices that the king can't see it, and the minister notices that the prefect can't see it. So what they do is they say, look, as long as those people remain imperceptive, we can go in and take it. So the minister ends up hiding the letter in plain sight. It's like, look, the prefect has his head in the sand, so I can just hide it in plain sight. But for Dupont, in the third glance, he notices, like, look, the first two glances have their heads in the sand, because when Dupin is able to recognize that the police and the police's method is flawed, and that the minister is overly confident in thinking that, you know, the letter could just be in plain sight and never taken, that definitely shows that the minister has you know, his head in the sand here. Or same thing with the minister in relation to the queen. The minister thinks, if I can put this decoy letter here, the queen's not going to notice, and she does, right? So in each of these scenes, we do see people, you know, putting their head in the sand like an ostrich, because each glance depends on the limitations of the previous one. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And because of that kind of blindness or imperceptiveness to what's going on, this is very much the other in psychoanalysis. And this is why, right here, La Politique de l'Autriche, again, I don't speak French, but right here, it's the politics of the ostrich. And it's a play on words here, because autruc, ostrich, is very similar to autre, which is other in French. So Lacan is being very creative here by, I don't know, I just think that's really cool that he's being creative here to try and say that the people in the story, or the subjects in the story, are looking at the preceding glances and making a decision based off of it, meaning that what the other is doing, the other's perception, causes me to act.
There's also a couple other words in that one. It's also got Autriche, which is Austria, and Autri, which is other people, not just the other, and tricher, which is to trick.
Oh, which one did you say? The last one? How does that go?
Tricher.
Cliché.
Tricher.
That's a cool one, because there's a trick going on here. that's great. Like people are tricking each other, right? The minister's tricking the prefect. Um, Dupont is tricking the prefect of police. The queen is trying to trick the king. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. And then the other one you said was that it's not just the other, but like other people. So it's not just like there's some, and that's why this piece is so good because Lacan is noting that there's an intersubjective right here, up here, intersubjective nature to this symbolic order. So it's not just that there's some other, like in the big brother type of way, but the other in the way of looking at preceding glances and how other people are interacting. I think that it makes Lacan a lot more fruitful to me.
I think too, though, I won't comment on whether or not there's a trick there, but I think what I get out of it is like he opened up like he was talking about basically defense mechanisms, right? Like one way to understand denial is as a defense mechanism. I know that's perhaps a little post-Freud, but I think that sense of it in terms of a symbolic function as a form of defense, irrespective of how true to Freud that might be, is kind of the politics he's talking about here, right? The ostrich attempting to shield itself from danger, the ostrich defending itself, is a kind of political technique divided among three partners, right? The defense depends on three people, so to speak, and one of those three people must pluck the feathers, right? Like to me, it's complicit, but it's complicit, interestingly enough, as a form of defense because part of the defense is to give up something
Ooh, like leaving
to
the decoy letter.
conceal.
Like leaving the decoy letter.
No, to let the letter be taken, in a sense. So think
Hmm.
about it. The ostrich sticks its head in the ground and presents its feathers for plucking. Someone plucks the feathers, right? The curious thing about the letter is, in a way, it's presented for the taking.
It's intersubjective as well. So it's akin to plucking the
Absolutely.
feather and also leaving a fake feather behind. Picking a feather, leaving one behind to make it appear as though I never picked it, when in reality we fundamentally changed the ostrich.
Right. And yet the ostrich gives itself to that, right? Because the ostrich presents what does the queen do? She presents the letter while concealing something else. What does the ostrich do? It presents its rear to conceal its front,
Mm,
or while
that's
concealing its
great.
front.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a
Yeah,
great way. And I also want to comment here too. It's like you made a point on like it's how it's a political technique. I mean, the story is
he
political.
says it is.
No, I know. And you mentioned that. Like I mean, I felt like like an air of a political nature here from a little bit of your comment too. Like you emphasized it, I think. Um, so I don't know. I just find that interesting too because I think like the story itself is a political one. I mean, we're dealing with royalty. We're dealing with like corruption, maybe, right? Like other things too. So I don't know. I don't know. I just think it's cool that he kind of is defining it as something political.
Yeah, it's ostrich policy, right?
Okay, we're close. We are close, people. What is repetition automatism? We are close. Given the intersubjective modulus of repetitive action, it remains to recognize in it a repetition automatism in the sense that it interests us in Freud's text. So just kind of a nice little segue here, or a nice little summary here that repetitive action is rooted in some intersubjectivity. So it's not like we can divorce the subject from everything in ways that maybe some psychoanalytic methods prior have tried, that there does seem to be some intersubjective nature to that repetitive action itself.
I think I mentioned this already last time the term came up, but repetition automatism is not the standard translation of Freud. It's repetition compulsion in both English and in French, but
Good to know.
times using repetition automatism, which has different implications, but not. I think we should wait to get into that instead of doing it right
Yeah,
now.
I agree with you because and this is part of the reason why I was reading the text. It's how is it different than repetition compulsion, and why is automatism being used here? Is it because it's focusing on an automatic action that's unconscious, whereas maybe compulsions might sometimes be conscious? I'm not sure exactly, but I think you're bringing up like a very important point here because we are going to get into Freud right here. So, you're bringing up a good point. Uh, let's get these two here. The plurality of subjects, of course, can be no objection for those who are long accustomed to the perspectives summarized by our formula. The unconscious is the discourse of the other. And we will not recall now what the notion of the immixture of subjects, recently introduced in our reanalysis of the dream of Irma's injection, adds to the discussion. What interests us today is the manner in which the subjects relay each other in their displacement during the intersubjective repetition. So a few things here. I think one is the unconscious is the discourse of the other, because for Lacan, the famous kind of statement, the unconscious is structured like a language, and that language here is the discourse of the other. It's the discourse of the ostriches in the previous glances, structuring the unconscious. Or at least that's how I read it. And he's also saying we want to be very clear. We will not recall the notion of the immixture of subjects. I don't really know why he's pointing this out.
This is from another.
Anyone have any ideas here?
He's probably referring to one of the other texts, like because this is from the second seminar. I think it's
Correct.
so. I think he's just referring to. I assume he's referring to another chapter in that. I'll double check the translator notes because he might have said something.
I mean, it looks like he's clearly referring to some seminar where where he talks about Freud in Freud's analysis of Irma's injection.
Yeah, it says see seminar 2, chapters 13 and 14. So I assume that's just what he's referring to.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
so he's not building on that. He's just being very clear about the unconscious being the discourse of the other.
and then also the translation of that single sentence paragraph that you also read is different in my version, and that one, I think it does have some significance because it's a what interests me today is the way in which the subjects, owing to their displacement, relay each other in the course of the intersubjective repetition. So it's owing to their displacement, whereas that says in their displacement, which implies a different sort of causality in it.
Yeah, I feel like when it says in their displacement, it sounds like it's a state of being. Whereas owing, can you say what you said again? Owing to their
Owing to their
displacement?
displacement.
Whereas that sounds a little bit more like something that's happened, right? I mean, so yeah, I do think that's important. Um, when with displacement, we see that emotions are redirected to to other things, right? And I wonder here if with the theft and concealment of the letter, are there various emotional or emotions that are displaced onto the letter? Is the letter now a source here of hidden anxiety, or is it a source of emotional turmoil for these subjects? So we're seeing this repetition, this intersubjective repetition, where the letter is stolen, it's hidden, it's stolen, it's hidden repeatedly, and it's very clear that the subjects owe their displacement in the sense that are they, or I'm wondering if Lacan is saying this, are they displacing their emotions or identity maybe onto this letter?
I'm not sure there, right? Because the character and the subject are different, right?
Say that again.
The character and the subject are different.
Okay.
Aren't
But,
aren't the characters exemplifying the subjects though?
is
Or
it about exemplification or is it about acting?
what would the difference be?
Um, I don't know. When I hear exemplify, I hear like how well it models the subjectivity. Whereas I think, and maybe I'm just being semantic here. So if I am, I apologize. But from a dramatic standpoint, right? It's the way in which it's the way in which the character is spoken by the subject, right? Because the heart of this is that the other speaks. The If it's the discourse of the other, right? The other speaks subjectivity, and in doing so, downriver from that speaks us, right? In some sort of personal sense. But my identity, I don't think, is really important to the other. I think the subjectivity is the more important thing to the other.
Okay. So you're taking this more as a question of, are you taking it in the way of almost identification through displacement?
No, I think what's displaced is so like if this was Foucault, it'd be words and things. What I'm seeing here is sort of like drama and narration. So there is the dramaturgical element of like actions, right? But then there's the kind of story element of narration, which is kind of
Like the
like
first and second scene, or there's like a
correct,
yeah,
primary, secondary.
yeah.
Exactly. The secondary is a form of commentary, he says, right? Which is one way to talk about narration. But it makes sense because he wants the structure to be a little bit different than the narration itself.
Oh, I see. So you might be taking this intersubjective repetition to not necessarily being the theft and concealment of the letter in terms of content. You're talking about in terms of form, like how the
Oh,
story is
from you know,
set up.
from a gloss mat standpoint, perhaps. But yeah, I think you're starting to see. Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what I'm saying.
Well, the reason why I'm hesitant is purely because I do think that with the ostrich example above, I think that I think Lacan's being strategic because I think that you can read it both ways. But I think the reason why I'm a little hesitant with more of like a form-based thing is purely because of the next sentence. So why don't we read it? This is our final stopping point. We are now going to get to what repetition automatism is. And then from here, we can talk about the form versus content distinction. Let's do it. We shall see that their displacement, we shall see that the subject's displacement is determined by the place which a pure signifier, the purloined letter, comes to occupy in their trio. And that is what will confirm for us its status as repetition automatism. So, repetition automatism is how a pure signifier is occupied in the symbolic chain. And the reason why I bring this up is because, Jack, to kind of get to your earlier point about like maybe narration, is I feel like the letter itself as a physical thing in its hiding place, in us not knowing the content of the letter, its place in the story is what is determining repetition automatism, because its place is allowing it to be hidden, taken, hidden again, stolen, hidden again, repeatedly.
Perhaps, but if you're gonna apply the Glossmat's framework, right, it's drama and narration as primary and secondary repression. Their narration or the commentary, uh, it's not the content of the letter, right? It's the act of narration. So it's that piece of dupe and relate, and I think this is the trick of discourse, right? Like this is what I'm seeing here. It's the trick of talking about it, and that's the relay, right? The relay as a form of talking about it, but also the relay as the way that these acts um, transition. And to your point, in relation to the letter, absolutely, right? But that the acts are part of this transition, because I think the displacement. I think what's curious about the displacement, right, is each transition in the repetition would suggest to me a different form of displacement, or rather, a different symbolic function. And that's the heart of the discourse, I think.
I see. I see what you're getting at. And I totally agree. I think that, yeah, I totally agree that as the scenes are changing or transitioning into different scenes or different glances and whatnot, or the tie between the dramaturgical element to the narration, or the dramaturgical scene, the narration,
Yes.
I see what you mean by displacement there. Um, but that displacement is determined by the letter.
I, I don't see
Because
that
their
I'm curious
displacement
about.
is determined by the place of the purloined letter. Like, I think it is a very literal thing, and the reason why is because when we're dealing with the symbolic chain, we're dealing with a dog is not this, a dog is not a cat, a dog is not an elephant, a dog is not Jack. But when we get to the letter, we don't know what the letter is. So imagine the chain: dog, cat, lizard, everything. There's some element in that chain which is a pure signifier for Lacan. And that pure signifier doesn't have a signified. Every other signifier does. So I think he's trying to very much say that the placement of this letter, because it doesn't have a signified, is what allows the other signs to have some level of fluidity, which because language is changing all the time. Lacan is not going to agree that there's some universal objective truth to language, and that it's because of this pure signifier we get repetition automatism. We get uh, the repeated kind of code or actions embedded within the symbolic chain.
I, yeah, I think I agree with you there. But I think too,
Yeah, yeah.
the
Sorry,
mechanism
go on, Jack.
is what I think too. What I'd add there is like, I think he still needs to build out the mechanism of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit just because I've been kind of taking notes through this in order to have like a decent discussion. So I'm clearly jumping ahead. We're just getting to the pure signifier now, so it doesn't make sense to be like, this is what the pure signifier is. But at least by reading this now, in the context of the symbolic chain, the pure signifier, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it and how all of the other signs, or I guess I'm still confused myself on the importance of the pure signifier. I mean, clearly it's intersubjective, meaning that all signs within this symbolic chain are interrelated, including with where the pure signifier is. I'm still lost with some of the importance. So, I mean, that's what I'm hoping to uncover a little bit with our conversations.
Yeah, definitely an appropriately so, definitely an investigation.
Okay. if we are good today, then we are good today. Thank you all for coming to the reading of Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter. We are pretty much on page 3 out of the 11 pages, but one of the pages is pretty much just all like endnotes anyways. So we will finish in future weeks for sure. Please swing by next Friday and we'll continue. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to try and end the recording here.
Darn. I was gonna say to Lily, like, I just want to make sure my comment. I hope I wasn't being semantic about it. I just wanted to make sure the emphasis was on the subject, not the character.
Oh, I don't think it's particularly pedantic or anything.
Like arguing from semantics. Like I don't want to
Oh,
split hairs on, emulation versus act. I just mean as long as we're recognizing that the subject is what he's interested in, not the character themselves. I'm good with how we're saying it.
no. And I think he's literally saying that too, right? He's literally saying like,
Exactly.
you don't want to have a fable. Like the issue with the fable is that it does get lost with maybe coherence, right? That's what he says earlier. So it's like, you don't want to just say Dupont is like the subject, right? And like, that's what you take from it. It's just using these characters as a medium to understand the subject. And I mean, that's how I read it. And I don't think you're being, you're good, Jack. I think all of your comments are great. I'm gonna end the recording now though, okay?
Oh yeah, you're good.